In the 70s, Etta James found herself trapped in a psychiatric hospital where she received a mysterious letter. She tore the envelope open, and the identity of its author was the biggest bombshell of all. Etta James had a legendary singing voice, but there was something else legendary about her: her lifestyle. The girl knew how to party, which she probably learned from her teenage mother. Unfortunately, it led her straight to the psych ward. That would be the end for most people, but James staged a legendary comeback that involved the Rolling Stones, Christina Aguilera, and even Beyonce. In Los Angeles, California, on January 25, 1938, 14-year-old Dorothy Hawkins gave birth to a baby girl who she named Jamesetta. Hawkins didn't have a husband and wasn't telling anyone who Jamesetta's father was. Some thought, judging by Jamesetta's light skin and almond eyes, that dad was Italian. Later, Hawkins would tell her daughter that her father was a pool hustler who went by Minnesota Fats. Could Jamesetta believe her mother? Well, she was quite a questionable character. Hawkins lived in the dangerous and impoverished Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles, but she had no problem leaving her young daughter alone in their apartment. When Hawkins left her baby alone, she was usually out with men. It was only a matter of time before something had to give. Soon, young Jamesetta came to the attention of social services, who took her from her mother and placed her with various foster parents. When Jamesetta talked about her mother, she simply called her the Mystery Lady. But if you think foster care was a positive change for Jamesetta, you've got it wrong. Two of Jamesetta's semi-regular foster parents were Sarge and Mama Lou. Sarge had a problem with drink, but he also liked music. When he noticed that Jamesetta could sing, he liked to show her off to his poker buddies. In the middle of the night, if Sarge felt like hearing music, he would wake up Jamesetta and demand that she sing for him and his buddies. If Jamesetta didn't comply with his demand, there would be a beating until she did. The poor girl needed to get away from Sarge. Maybe the church would help. One of Jamesetta's escapes from a horrible home life was at church. She attended St. Paul's Baptist Church, and people there soon noticed her for her beautiful singing voice. The music director of the church took Jamesetta under his wing and decided to train her to be a real singer. The director's name was James Earl Hines, but he wasn't a savior either. He helped make James a better singer, but his methods were cruel and unusual. Hines wanted to get Jamesetta's voice to come from her gut, not her chest, and he had a brutal method to make it happen. Whenever Jamesetta would sing from her chest, he'd punch her. Jamesetta's escape from her home life had now turned into a new nightmare. Yet, despite the chest pounding, James had great respect for Hines and what he did for her voice. Because of her work with Hines, or in spite of it, Jamesetta's voice became extraordinary. The Chitlin Circuit was a series of venues around America that provided black entertainers a place to perform for black audiences. This was hugely important because of segregation, which severely limited opportunities for black performers. Through this circuit, Jamesetta got a chance to perform in Nashville, Tennessee at R&B clubs. She grew up performing on the Chitlin Circuit, but Sarge and Mama Lou were still her guardians. This went on until tragedy struck. Jamesetta was just 12 years old when she was working in clubs and bars. This was only possible while the lenient Mama Lou and Sarge were her guardians and allowed it. In 1950, however, Mama Lou passed. So who would take care of James now? Well, out of the woodwork popped Jamesetta's real mother. She lived in San Francisco and wanted Jamesetta with her. Jamesetta's mother, Dorothy Hawkins, had migrated with many African Americans to the Fillmore district in San Francisco, California. There was some tension there, as white residents were unsure about having such a large influx of African Americans. Jamesetta didn't take notice of the race relations. Instead, she started skipping school and drinking. There was something else delinquent about Jamesetta's behavior. She liked doo-wop music. You'd think Mom would be happy about this interest in music. Instead, she hated it. Jamesetta's mother was a fan of music, but not of the doo-wop that her daughter was listening to. Hawkins thought jazz was the only way to go, and her favorite singer was Billie Holiday. Hawkins believed that jazz brought out more sophistication than what Jamesetta was trying to do. Jamesetta respected performers like Holiday, but her heart was in a different sound. James Etta put together a girl group and they started performing on street corners. Because the young women in the group were mostly light-skinned like James, they chose the name the Crelettes. James Etta was still barely a teenager, and her dream was already coming true. But this was only the beginning. Her career would move forward because of one man, the multi-talented Johnny Otis. James Etta met Otis in one of two ways. The story is unclear. Either Otis heard the Crelettes playing in LA, or James Etta pursued Otis at his hotel room after performance and begged for an audition. Knowing James, I'd put my money on the latter. Whichever it was, Otis took the Crelettes and decided to make them into stars. The first thing they had to change, however, was their name. Otis arranged to get the Crelettes signed up to Modern Records, but there was a catch. He thought the group's name was a little on the nose and offered up Peaches as an alternative. The name stuck, and Modern Records signed them up. But that wasn't all he gave her. Otis also thought that the name James Etta was a bit of a mouthful. His solution was simple. Just reverse the two parts of her name and put a space between them. Voila, Etta James was born. At this time, answer songs were extremely popular. An answer song was when one artist wrote and performed a song in answer to the lyrics of another artist's song. Otis had an idea to answer a Hank Ballard song called Work With Me Annie, and he wanted James to help him with it. Well, Work With Me Annie already had some very racy lyrics, but James and Otis had a plan to go one step further. Now remember, James was just 16 years old at this time, while Otis was in his 30s. Together, their goal was to outdo the innuendo in Work With Me Annie. The result was Roll With Me Henry. Forget the lyrics, even the title was too risque for the time. Many thought it referred to a roll in the hay, which it probably did. To avoid the expected censorship, they renamed the song The Wallflower. This was so it sounded like the planned activity was dancing, and not something more horizontal. So where was Mom in all this? Did she approve of her daughter writing dirty songs with an older man? James's mother wasn't doing much of a job of raising her daughter, so James moved in with Otis, who was paying James $10 for every performance and keeping the rest. But as far as her writing skills went, Otis was much more generous. Her $14,000 for writing The Wallflower went into a trust fund that James could have when she turned 21. After all, what would a young woman need that much money for? It would likely just get her into trouble. Well, just you wait and see. James eventually recorded The Wallflower with Peaches and it became a hit. By February of 1955, the Hot Rhythm and Blues tracks put it at number 1. James had her first taste of stardom, and she was ready for more. What she probably didn't see coming was when superstar Little Richard took notice of her and her group Peaches. When James heard that Little Richard was interested, she decided to give herself a makeover. At this point in her career, James wanted to change her look. She said she'd always been a tomboy, but she knew deep down that this wouldn't work for the music world. So, she decided to be a glamour girl. She donned high heels, rhinestone earrings, and even a fishtail gown. She may have been a teenager, but she looked like someone much older. James was about to take her new gussied-up look on the road, and there was sure to be trouble. Little Richard would go on to get the title the Architect of Rock and Roll, but at this point, he was just a very popular musician. He'd heard Peaches perform, and he wanted them for his national tour. They set out in 1956 and played all over the United States. This was a dream come true for James, but something closer to a nightmare happened while she was on tour. Being on tour often meant driving from one gig to another in a car. James was in Texas in a car full of men when they became lost. When the driver pulled over to ask an officer for directions, it became a dangerous situation. The officer looked into the car and saw what he thought was a white girl in a car full of black men. This was Texas in the 50s, so he decided to make a big deal about it. The problem was that James's skin was so light, the officer thought she was white. Not only was the officer not used to seeing the situation, it was actually against the law in Texas. The officer had to repeatedly ask James if she was black or white, and not in such nice terms. Finally, James told the officer the truth, and they were free to go. Apparently, a black girl alone in a car full of white men was fine. James got out of this predicament unscathed, but bad things were happening back at home as well. Back in those days, it was common for white artists to borrow songs from black musicians and make them popular to a white audience. Georgia Gibbs was one star who had built a career on crossover hits. Gibbs took The Wallflower, renamed it Dance With Me Henry, and made it into a huge hit. In fact, it topped the Billboard Hot 100 that year. Clearly, James was full of talent, and it seemed everyone wanted a piece of it. Next, James pulled a Beyonce, or Diana Ross for that matter, and walked away from her group Peaches and went solo. Soon she had her own hit with Good Rockin' Daddy. The next hit, however, didn't come so easily. Soon, James was likely regretting her decision to go out on her own. In a desperate move, she decided to leave Modern Records and join Chess Records. The move quickly paid off. While with Chess Records, James had a string of hits. She also got a man. While touring with Little Richard, James occasionally performed alongside the Moonglows. Now the Moonglows' founder, Harvey Fuqua, was also with Chess Records. James and Fuqua sang a couple of duets and the chemistry was obvious. Soon, James had her first serious boyfriend. At least, that's what she claimed. But was this actually James's first relationship? Some of her past acquaintances say no. James toured with Bobby Murray for more than 20 years, and he has something different to say about James's first boyfriend. He swears that when James was just 16 years old, she dated musician B.B. King, who would have been 29 at the time. If this sounds like idle gossip, consider this. A few years later, King released a single called Sweet 16. Even James herself said that she thought the song was about her. Next, James was about to go from one king to another. While she was hanging around with B.B. King, James met a future king, Elvis Presley. As it turned out, the 19-year-old Presley was a huge fan of B.B. King's. Presley also impressed James, and not just his singing talent. James often commented on his good manners. Eventually, James teamed up and performed with the future king of rock and roll just outside Memphis, Tennessee. James seemed to always be at the center of everything happening in music. She still, however, hadn't made an album yet. James had 2 hit singles doing duets, and then it was time to once again strike out on her own. What followed was 1960's All I Could Do Was Cry, which hit the number 2 spot on the R&B charts. Leonard Chess of Chess Records saw something in James. He thought she could cross over from R&B to pop. His idea to make this happen was to bring in string instruments. The result was My Dearest Darling, which hit the number 5 spot. James's singles clearly had the juice. It was now time for her to make her debut album. James's first album was At Last. The response didn't quite match Chess Records' prediction, but over time, critics have come to see it as hugely significant. In fact, AllMusic gave it 5 stars out of 5, and Rolling Stone eventually put it at spot number 191 for their top 500 greatest albums of all time. The album also contained what many would later see as James's signature song, At Last. But if you think James was getting rich with all this, you don't know record companies. In all, James worked for Chess Records for 14 years, and they manipulated her all that time. Sadly, the only money she saw from Chess over those years was a meager $10,000. Instead of paying what their artists actually deserved, Chess Records gave them Cadillacs. That's actually where the title of the 2008 film Cadillac Records took its name. Most of the money she earned came from her performing live. However, maybe it was a good thing that she didn't get all the money. If she did, she'd probably be using it for a very destructive purpose. James continued to record and perform throughout the 1960s. She added a gospel sound to her repertoire, but not everything was godly in her life. Like a lot of musicians at this time, she had a drug problem, and it was a costly one. James's need for her drug of choice cost her more than she was making. This led her to do some pretty horrible things. At one point in her career, James lost the need to hide her addiction. At one concert, members of the audience could easily see bandages on her arms while she was on stage. This could only mean one thing: the bandages covered the scars from where she'd been injecting. It seemed that James didn't care who knew her dirty little secrets anymore. James needed someone to give her guidance, and a famous person was about to provide it. At one point in her life, James got a chance to meet the woman who her mother thought was the queen of jazz sophistication, Billie Holiday. Holiday, who had her own addiction issues, saw James and knew where her career was heading. She told James flat out, "Don't get involved in drinking and partying and staying out late." Sadly, James didn't listen to Holiday, not even a little bit. James's addiction made her do terrible things. Things like taking money from friends, making prescription forgeries, and even selling her body on occasion. Eventually, in 1966, the law caught up with her and she was put on probation. Her fine for writing a bad check was $500. She later ignored her probation and had to spend a week and a half in prison. Yet during this sad time in her life, she surprisingly sparked a new romance. After making her first disco song in the basement, James headed to Alabama. While there, she recorded Tell Mama and its B-side, I'd Rather Go Blind. She wrote the song with Ellington Jordan, a prisoner she'd met, and decided not to have her name as the co-writer. Her idea was that this would save her money for herself and keep it from the tax man. At the same time, she was dating a guy named Billy Foster, so she wrote down his name as the co-writer. Foster will go down in history as the writer of this song, even though he didn't do a thing. In 1968, James shared more than a song with Foster. They had a child and named him Donto. Back in those days, there were a lot more laws about what was right and wrong when it came to dating. One such rule was that a man and a woman could only share a hotel room if they were husband and wife. When officers found out James was in a room with a man, they hauled her into the station. Believe it or not, at this time, this was a chargeable offense, and they threw the book at James. In 1969, James was once again in rehab for her addiction, and she met artist Mills, who was also an addict. The saintly Mills didn't mind becoming a replacement dad to Donto, even though he wasn't the biological father. Like her mother, James didn't see the importance of keeping fathers involved in their children's lives. Mills was obviously deeply in love with James, and later, he would pay for it dearly. James continued to perform and record during this problematic decade of her life. In 1969, however, she received some horrible news. Leonard Chess, the man who had hired her at Chess Records and scammed her, had suddenly passed due to a heart attack. Chess was only 52 when this happened, and the shock of it devastated James. The 60s were about to become the 70s. What would this mean for Etta James? The 1970s may have been a brand new decade, but James was having the same old problems. In 1973, officers took her and her husband in for possession, and in 1974, the court sent her to a drug treatment facility. Doctors there treated her with methadone, which she also became addicted to. Compared to her husband, however, she got off lightly. Mills ended up getting a 10-year prison sentence. Being married to James was not working out in his favor. James eventually found her way to the Tarzana Psychiatric Hospital, where she spent 17 months in care. At the hospital, she said that almost all of the other patients were white kids. One day in the common area, some rock music was playing, and a Rod Stewart song came on. It turned out that song was a cover of James's I'd Rather Go Blind. When the other patients heard that she had written it, they gained a new respect for their psych ward inmate. Besides this one fond memory, her time at the hospital remained a low point in her life. Luckily, the only direction she could go after such a low was up. While still in the psych ward, James received a mysterious letter. It said it was from none other than the Rolling Stones' Keith Richards, who also knew a thing or two about addiction. What would Richards want with her? In the letter, he made her an offer. If you can stay clean, you can tour with the Stones. If that wasn't a reason to fight addiction, I don't know what is. In 1976, Richards followed through on his promise to James. James was now a much healthier girl than before, but it didn't stop her from rocking with the Stones. The truth was that neither she, nor Richards for the matter, were free of drug use. Following working with the Rolling Stones, James stopped recording and spent almost 10 years dealing with her addiction issues. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.